You are Howard Bloom.
I've been called that, but actually I'm a cheap imitation.
Well, what makes the cheap imitation not Howard Bloom? What makes Howard Bloom Howard Bloom?
Well, that's a good question. You carry around in yourself a bundle of passions, whether you know they're there or not, and they drive you. And if you succeed in learning how to surf them and put them to your advantage, you can have a magnificent, astonishing, amazing life. A lot of hard parts, a lot of difficult parts, a lot of pain, but somehow you'll end up overcoming every pain but the last one.
So, what made you fall in love with being a publicist in the entertainment world?
It was very weird. I mean, I fell in love with science when I was 10 years old because it looked like it gave me a refuge. Nobody wanted me in Buffalo, New York. My parents didn't pay any attention to me. Other kids hated me and drove me out of their activities. They wouldn't let me anywhere near their activities, as a matter of fact. And they picked on me and all kinds of stuff. So there was no room for me. And one day I am sitting in my family's big living room, and it's dark because the curtains are drawn, even though it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and there will probably be wonderful things to see out the window. And you know how you know the location of every book in your parents' home? Well, there was a book I didn't know the location for, and it was in my hands. God knows where it came from. And it said, "The first rule of science is the truth at any price, including the price of your life." And it told the story of Galileo, and it told it all wrong. It said Galileo would have been willing to go to the stake and be burned alive in order to continue to profess his truth, that the earth moved around the sun, not the other way around. That's all untrue. But it's what I needed to hear. I needed to hear a message of courage. And the second one was, look at things right under your noses if you've never seen them before, and then proceed from there. Look at things that you and everybody around you take for granted, and then proceed from there. And it gave the example of Anton von Leeuwenhoek, who invented the microscope, looking down at a fluid and seeing what he called animalcules, little things with whip-like tails, invisible little things, scooting along with seemingly their own willpower. The book didn't tell me another little fact, which is that the fluid he was looking at was human sperm. And so what is the most readily available source for fresh human sperm when you've just managed to grind a lens so that it will zero in on really teeny-weeny things for the very first time in human history? Where do you get that sperm from? Well, in other words, Anton von Leeuwenhoek was willing to confess to masturbation in his letters, at least implicitly, to the Royal Society. Well, it didn't tell me that. What it basically gave me these first two principles. And for the first time, it put me in the presence of two people who couldn't throw me out. They could not say, "Get out." And they couldn't say, "Get out, Sean," because they were dead. And for the first time in my life, I had a gang I could hang around with. So I'd been in science for 12 and a half years when I realized I was an atheist. And when I realized I was an atheist, well, I first of all had to tuck the notion very far in the back of my mind because my bar mitzvah was coming up, and it was the first party I was ever going to be invited to, and I was actually going to get presents, lots and lots of them, and the subject of attention at the party would be me. And I mean, who can resist that? And if I was an atheist, no bar mitzvah. So I kept it, in the dark closet at the back of my mind until I'd finished signing or writing all of the thank you notes, which took 2 months. And all of a sudden, okay, I'm an atheist. But this took place in something like June. And in September, only 2 months later, the Jewish high holidays come. And my parents never go to temple. But for the holidays, no, it's a whole different scene. These are sacred. These are important. So they tried to drag me to high holiday services. And in Buffalo, my hometown, on Richmond Avenue, while I was holding on to the door frame of our blue Fraser, it's an automobile, an old kind of automobile, and they were grabbing at my ankles and trying to get me pried from the car, I realized there's an intensity of passion going on here. My parents feel very strongly about this. And by now, I've spent a quarter of my life in science, so I've read a lot of anthropology books. And every tribe I've ever read about anywhere on the planet has also felt very strongly about similar things. So if the gods are not up there, and if the gods are not down there, where are they? Well, that means they've got to be in here someplace. And that means, Bloom, your job, remember the truth at any price, including the price of your life, and look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before. Your job is not to look at things right under your nose. Your job is to look at things right behind your nose. And from that point on, my job, one of them in science, was to find the gods inside of us. Okay, well, science was my base, and I did little things like I designed my first Boolean algebra, or I built my first Boolean algebra machine when I was 12. I co-designed a computer that won some science fair prizes when I was 12. My mom trotted me off to the University of Buffalo when I was 12 to sit down for a meeting with the head of the graduate physics department, not the undergraduate physics department, the graduate physics department at the University of Buffalo. It was probably supposed to be a courtesy visit because, after all, my mom must have pulled a lot of strings. What head of a graduate department wants to meet with a 12-year-old? And the meeting lasted an hour. And it lasted an hour because the hottest topic of the day was in cosmology. It was steady-state theory versus Big Bang theory. And we were discussing the Doppler shift and Big Bang theory versus steady-state theory. And, I mean, as I said, it was the hot topic of the day. So we just went on and on and on about it. Then when I was 16, I got to work at the world's largest cancer research facility. So I spent my youth in science, my teenage years. Teenagers didn't want to have me as part of their culture. Fine. I was still in with Galileo and von Leeuwenhoek, those who had followed them. So when I finally got to college, well, first of all, another thing happened when I was 12. I didn't realize, and I don't know if anybody else watching this will have this problem. I didn't realize it, but nobody actually ever looked at me. In school, other kids did not make eye contact, not at all. And one day in 8th grade, a girl who I thought loathed me swiveled her eyes and actually made eye contact. And it was a little bit shocking because it had never happened before. And she then opened her mouth, which was even more shocking. And she said, "I told my mom that you understand the theory of relativity." Well, the only thing I had going for me was my reputation for having a brain. When I was 11, the kids decided to call me the sickly scientist. It was some form of attention and acknowledgement, after all. And I couldn't admit that I didn't know the theory of relativity. So I got on my bicycle as soon as school got out, and I went down to the library where the librarians knew me better than my parents did, and rushed in. And by then they'd gotten used to the fact that we don't limit him to the kids section, let him read everything in the adult section. And I said, "Give me everything you got on relativity." So they gave me a great big fat book and a little tiny skinny book. And the great big fat book was the first one that I tackled, and it was all equations. There were only 2 sentences on a 2-page spread, and the rest was all equations. I have no clue to equations. I still don't have a clue when it comes to equations. So at any rate, I got through about 50 pages of that book, and then 8 o'clock rolled around. Because one of the things I learned is, even if you're reading something you don't think you understand a word of, if you go all the way to the end, by the time you're finished, you have a sense of what the thing was about. So, but it was 8 o'clock. My parents were going to put me to sleep in 2 hours. I had to understand the theory of relativity by the next morning. So I turned to the little skinny book, the first book was by Einstein and some collaborators. The second book was just by Einstein. And I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but sometimes a writer seems to reach out through the pages and grab you by the lapel and put your nose up to his and give you a personal message. Okay, Einstein grabbed me by the lapels through the introduction to this book, and he basically said this: "Schmuck. If you want to be a genius, it's not enough to come up with a theory only 7 men in the world can understand. You have to be able to come up with that theory. Then you have to be able to explain it so clearly that anyone with a high school education and a reasonable degree of intelligence can understand it." In other words, Einstein said, to be a scientific thinker, you are going to have to be a writer. So when I was 16, I got obsessed with writing. And after dropping out of school and hitchhiking and riding the rails and developing a group of accidental followers and accidentally helped start a movement that would be called, wouldn't get a name for another year, was eventually called the hippie movement, I came back to school. And because I'd spent my whole life in science, that's the way it seemed anyway, I didn't major in science. That didn't seem necessary. I majored in English literature, hoping they would teach me how to write. And I minored in psychology because psychology is at the root of all of these forms of mass emotion that the gods are involved with. The gods, in my opinion, are involved with the kinds of mass passions that make history. Adolf Hitler was able to accomplish everything he accomplished because he was a brilliant manipulator, or it's not exactly the right word, he was a brilliant igniter of ecstatic passions, of the kind of passions that make us feel we've risen above ourselves and become part of something so much larger than ourselves that it gives us a majesty we would never have.
So what exactly is the land where the gods are, and how did it bring you to music?
Okay, it's a little tricky. I had a wife. I got married before my sophomore year of college to a woman with a 5-year-old child, and my wife told me she was tired of having husbands who were students. Her first husband had been at Dartmouth, and he'd been a student. And now she'd been through another 3 years of it with me, almost 4. And I didn't want to lose my wife, and I didn't really want to go to grad school. To me, grad school seemed like an Auschwitz for the mind, because instead of going into the belly of the beast and understanding those mass passions that made history, the passions that Hitler brought to the surface, for one, the passions where the gods are, I would be giving paper and pencil tests to 22 college students at a time in exchange for credit toward their psychology requirement. And how passionate are students? To what extent are those students going to show the kind of mass passion that showed up for Hitler's torchlight parades? Not at all. I was going to be ripped away from everything that interested me. So I walked in. I had been kidnapped. I had been kidnapped by the poet in residence, who told me one day, "Stay after class, close the door." Okay, I did. He said, "Okay, listen, you. I told you last year I wanted you on the staff of a literary magazine. You never showed up. This year I'm telling you, you are the literary magazine. You're the editor. You have the budget. You don't even have a faculty advisor. The minute you walk out of this room, it is you." And so I went out into the corridor. I hated literary magazines. They look so boring. And I went out into the corridor looking very perplexed, and a kid stopped me and said, "What's wrong? Can I help you?" And I said, "I've been made the editor of the literary magazine, and I hate literary magazines." And he took me down to coffee and said, "Okay, now, if you could do anything you wanted with this magazine, what would it be?" And I said, "I'd make it a picture book." So I made it an experimental graphics and literary magazine, and it raised a ruckus. I mean, I started getting phone calls from the art directors at Look, which was a huge, gorgeous, glossy magazine, and Evergreen Review, which was the leading publication for bohemians in the country, and Boy's Life. Ironically, I'd been thrown out of the Boy Scouts for incompetence and Morse code, and now Boy's Life, the Boy Scout magazine, was calling me to have a meeting. I was a student, for God's sakes. Okay, so school was over. I'd gotten out with, all these incredible grades and stuff like that. And I walked into the apartment of one of my artists from the magazine one day, just a brilliant artist. And there was no furniture in the room. There was wall-to-wall carpeting, that's all. And his wife, and his baby were all sitting on the carpet crying. And I asked them what was wrong, and they said, "We're being thrown out of our apartment. We can't pay the rent. The furniture's all been repossessed." And they were about to turn off the electricity and the phone. So I said, "Well, your work is brilliant. If I show it to a few people over the next few weeks, they'll give you work. Then you'll be able to pay your rent. And I haven't made a commitment for the summer yet." So I started taking out his portfolio and the portfolio of some of the other artists. We formed a studio together. And by the end of the summer, I'd gotten New York Magazine interested in doing a feature on us. but I hadn't sold any work, and I was frustrated, and I'm obsessive compulsive. So I like to finish projects. I don't like to leave them hanging in the beginning or the middle. So between Auschwitz for the Mind, a wife who didn't want me to go to grad school, knowing that I was not going to find what I wanted in grad school, and realizing that, hey, there's this thing you never paid any attention to in your life, Bloom, called pop culture. You've never listened to its music or anything. But if you get in there, you may get into the belly of the beast. You may get into the beating heart where modern myths are made. You may get into the land where the gods are. So I called Columbia, or I wrote to Columbia University where I was supposed to go and said, I have a back problem. I have to admit that wasn't true. I don't like untruths. But at any rate, and didn't show up and continued working on the art studio. And then one day, 3 years later, writing, all the time writing. Because remember, Einstein had told me, to be a scientific thinker, you must write. So I became a contributing editor to 2 magazines. One was called Natural Lifestyles. The other was an incredible, seminal, underground fashion magazine called Rags. And I was finally being printed in magazines, 175 things I did for Rags. I became contributing editors to both of them. And one day, somebody walked up to me at a parapsychology conference, because I liked to cover weird science, pseudoscience, and said, would you like to edit a magazine? Well, to write, I'd been getting up at 6:30 in the morning, writing until 8:30, then going off to the art studio, then coming home at night and working until midnight. And I said, yes, because the idea was, if I were paid to be a magazine editor, I could write during the day and wouldn't have to get up at 6 o'clock or 6:30 in the morning. I walked into the publisher's office without having asked what the magazine was about. Now, normally, I would research like crazy if I were going for a job interview, but this had been set up so strangely and casually. And when I got there, it turned out the magazine was called Circus, but it wasn't about clowns and elephants. It was about rock and roll. And the publisher was desperate. His staff had left a couple of weeks earlier. He had only 2 weeks to get the magazine in, on deadline, because he had commitments to distributors. So he was willing to take anybody who felt he could edit the magazine. Well, I felt I could edit the magazine. I felt remember, one summer when I wanted a job, and I wanted a job in writing, I had gone through the New York Times want ads, and I had taken the names of all 100 companies that dealt with jobs in editorial, in writing. I called the first 98 companies on that list, 98 whatever they're called, job hunt firms, and every single one of them said, no, we don't have anything for you. And the 99th said, we've got something for you. It's in New Brunswick, New Jersey, at the national headquarters of the Boy Scouts of America, this group that keeps cropping up in my life despite the fact that it tossed me out. And I spent a summer writing about stalking and tracking and camouflage. I, who can't find my way into the woods, much less out of the woods, but I took it very seriously. If I was telling you how to stalk a bunny rabbit, I wanted to be able to give you such good advice that you could get within nose-touching distance before the rabbit even knew you were there. So I figured it doesn't matter what the magazine is about. Whatever it's about, I'll study it, and I'll study the kids, and if I love them and want to please them, then things will work. Well, it turned out to be about rock and roll. I hadn't been listening to rock and roll. I listened to Rachmaninoff and Beethoven and Bartók and Stravinsky. However, the little tiny bit of rock and roll I'd heard trickling around sounded to me like the fulfillment of every Baroque musician's dream in the 1700s, because it had strong rhythm, strong bass, and strong treble. And those are the two things, rhythm, bass, and treble, under Baroque music. And the same things are under rock and roll music, of all things. So I took the job, and my publisher said, look, set me a problem. There are these 2 magazines in Europe, Bravo and Salut les copains, and they are selling 1.5 million copies per issue. And our magazine is selling 30,000 copies. And the biggest selling rock publication in America, Rolling Stone, is selling 250,000 copies. But those countries are a fifth the size of ours. So Rolling Stone here should be selling 7.5 million copies. How do we get up to that level? Plus, my favorite magazine, he said, is Time Magazine. I want this to read like Time Magazine. So I spent a year dissecting every aspect of Time, which I'd grown up reading obsessively. I used to win the Time. My best friend and I used to tie every year for the Time Magazine contest to see who knew the most current events in the year, which means that there was only one prize per school and neither of us either got a prize. They couldn't cut it in half. At any rate, the point is, I spent a year and a half dissecting these magazines as if they were frogs on a table. I worked all my waking hours. I worked 7 days a week. I moved my work to my home on Saturdays and Sundays. My poor wife had to deliver my food to my typewriter so I could keep working and not lose a beat. And at the end of the year, I went back to the publisher and said, okay, I figured these magazines out. And if you let me first of all, if you give me access to sales figures, and if you let me do what I want to do, I guarantee you magazine sales. So, by the way, I also did a bunch of trips to Connecticut to do anthropological style work with kids and discover and figure out their subcultural structure and stuff like that. But you have to ultimately figure out things here in your empathic centers. You have to become the kids, which is not hard when you're in your late 20s and no kid has ever allowed you to be a kid before. It's the first time that pent-up adolescence in you was allowed to come out. So my publisher gave me the go-ahead, and in the course of 12 issues, we increased in sales 211%.
That's awesome.
Yes, and we became the best-selling music monthly in the country. So by a long shot. And 6 months into this, my publisher walked into my office and said, isn't it about time we talk about a raise? Well, I'd never worked for anybody else. I'd been self-employed in the art studio, and I didn't know about raises. So that sort of locked me for a loop, and I called all my friends from Rags, the underground fashion magazine, who by now were working for things like Vogue, and one of them was co-founding a magazine called Ms. With Gloria Steinem, and said, well, here's what I do. What should I get paid? One day, when we were still back at Gulf and Western, these 14 companies were losers. 12 of them we'd never even seen the presidents of. They were like hallucinations somebody had come up with on a peyote trip or something like that. They really didn't exist. Plus, our president's son was dying of cancer, which means he was dying of leukemia, which means our president would come into the office at 9 o'clock every day, walk into his office, lock the huge wooden doors to his executive suite, and we wouldn't see him. We wouldn't see him at all. There was no direction to the company whatsoever. Well, one day, and I spotted 2 companies in this batch of losers that were brilliant, that had wonderful, wonderful teams, and I put all my time into those 2 companies. One was Sire Records, Seymour Stein's company, and the other was Dot Records, which was number 3 in the country in Western business and wanted to be number 1 and was very, very committed to achieving that goal. So, but one day, the A&R guy, A&R is Artist and Repertoire, it means the talent scouter, the talent scout for Paramount Records, one of our really losing labels, walked into my office and said, I got this new star. She's the 13-year-old girl from Crown Heights, Brooklyn. She's the greatest singer you've ever seen in your life. She's going to be a gorilla. She's going to be a smash, yada, yada, yada. Yada, yada, yada was a phrase he used all the time. And yes, I'd heard about lots of gorillas and smashes from him, and none of them had gone anywhere. So I had zero confidence in this and was going to pay it no attention until he said, and I've got her doing a showcase tomorrow at the Plaza Hotel. Now look, I'm in a 23rd story office overlooking the park at Columbus Circle, right? And the Plaza Hotel is a 5-minute, extraordinarily pleasant walk away. And I'm in charge of the artist relations department, which means my job is to show artists we care about them. Although I'm rather blunt in the job. If an artist is not going to get any attention from the company, I tend to tell them that. Nonetheless, There's no way in hell I can get out of a 5-minute walk to a showcase at the Plaza Hotel. So I go over to the showcase room, and it's a nightclub with these tiered platforms for the tables so that everybody can see. It's like a little amphitheater, and I'm sitting at my little amphitheater seat, and all of a sudden, this squashed-looking little black woman comes out on stage, looking almost like a pygmy. And the minute she comes out, you have the feeling that she has grabbed you by the trachea and put her nose up to yours and has her eyes lighting your eyes up, and you are there to sit and obey, period. She was amazing. You've never seen anything like it in your life. So I went back to my office and changed my priorities, and in addition to Sire Records and Dot Records, my new priority was Stephanie Mills. And the next day, because our company was running on autopilot, a coup had been pulled within Gulf and Western. Another one of Gulf and Western's companies was Paramount Pictures. And Paramount Pictures was doing very well. And it was doing very well under the guidance of a man who was the Napoleon of the film industry. His name was Frank Yablans. And he had a reputation that really preceded him. You do not mess with Frank Yablans. Well, all of a sudden, the next day, we were told that we were due at 10 o'clock for a staff meeting. Well, guess what? We'd never had a staff meeting before. Never. In fact, we had never seen the conference room lit. It had always been this dark room in which people put stray things on the table. Chairs, other tables, anything that, was getting in the way. So we arrived at the conference room, and it was lit to our surprise, and the table was dusted to our surprise, and there were agendas in front of us. Agendas listing 25 records we'd never heard of before in our lives. The president, our president, who was 6'2", took his place at the head of the table and began to speak, but then all of a sudden, behind us at the door, we felt a presence, and it was as if Napoleon had walked in surrounded by all of his troops and a full score orchestra and shots of thunderbolts and storm clouds. And in walked this 5'4" guy who we only saw out of the corner of our eye. And as he walked down the length of the table, our president began to shrink. And he got lower and lower and lower and lower in his seat until you could barely see his head above the table. And then when Frank Yablans reached his position, he slid out of his chair like a jellyfish and slid into the chair next to it. And Frank Yablans took over the head of the table. So this little power package, Frank Yablans, stands at the head of the table, and he says to the executive on his immediate left, he looks at the agenda, he looks at record number 1, and he says, "You, what are you doing about this record?" And none of us are doing anything about these records because none of us have ever heard of them before. So executive number 1, the head of the promotion department, the department that gets radio airplay, well, he does something I'd heard about for years that I've never actually seen before. It's called bullshit. I had never seen it. And he comes out with this amazing story about all the things he's doing for this record that he's never heard before. Then Yablans gets to executive number 2, and he says, "You, what are you doing about this record?" And executive number 2, who's the sales head, makes up an equally astonishing story about all the things that he is doing for this record. And then he gets down to me. And I say, "Mr. Yablans, I'm not doing anything about any of these records. They are a foolish waste of our time. They are not going to go anywhere. I'm working on a woman named Stephanie Mills." And then I describe Stephanie Mills' performance. And as soon as I finish, Frank Yablans walks very abruptly out of the room. Well, we all crowd toward the exit, and as we are crowding through the door, My boss, my immediate superior, the guy that Seymour Stein had to convince to hire me, grabs me by the arm so hard that I have the marks in my arm for a week and says, "You none. If you ever do that again, you are fired." Okay, I get to my office. My secretary says, "There's a call waiting for you from Mr. Yablon's office." I get on the phone. It's Mr. Yablon's secretary. She says, "Mr. Yablon's is calling a meeting of all of his department heads and vice presidents tomorrow at noon. He wants you there. He wants Stephanie Mills there." So the next day, Stephanie and I show up. And Yablon's makes me an unofficial member of the Paramount Pictures team. In other words, every time they're organizing, every time they're screening a film, they have me at the screening. Every time they are brainstorming the campaign for a film, they have me at the brainstorming session. They give me no orders about what to do whatsoever. They don't even frame the situation for me. They just let me sit there and come up with my own ideas. And whatever ideas I come up with, they're good to go. It's automatic. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. And 2 weeks later, my boss, non-boss, who actually was a very good, decent, hardworking human being, he's fired. So the story, there's a moral to the story. First of all, that's how I do business. Period. It's the truth that counts. Remember, the truth at any price, including the price of your life. And look at things right under your noses if you've never seen them before. If 12 record labels are not really record labels, then act on that. And focus your energies where they're going to make the most difference. Don't be fooled by convention. And we're going to get eventually to chronic fatigue syndrome. Doing this kind of thing, it comes naturally to me. It is me. But it takes strength. It takes a lot of strength. And that strength would someday disappear. Okay, so we're purchased by ABC Records. And all of a sudden I see something I've never seen before in my time in the record industry, my whole entire year in the record industry at Gulf and Western. This company has a hit. They have a hit at number 3 on the pop charts. I've never had the advantage of that before. So I jump on it. I want to work on it. I really want to work on it. And then I discover something very interesting. The lead singer is black. The staff of the record company has one token black man, and the rest are white. And among white people in 1975, it is not cool to work with black music. What, are you crazy? Black music is American music. No, it is not cool to work with black music. So the people in the company who know how to be hip and know how to look good on Wilshire Boulevard and Sunset Boulevard, they're not going to have anything to do with this record. And they assume I'm not going to have anything to do with this record because they assume I want to be hip with them. Well, I've never been hip. I don't give a shit about being hip. I jump on this record. And when the band's manager is supposed to be coming into New York, I see opportunity. So I get a limo and go out to the airport and pick him up. His plane comes in at 5 o'clock. That means I know I've got 2 hours alone with this man. He cannot leave because he's stuck in a limo with me in New York City traffic. And I tell him a very simple thing. Look, your band prides itself on being democratic. It prides itself on listening to every single member. Well, if you allow me to take the lead singer and to pull her right into the forefront and put the rest of the band in the background, and if you cover my ass on this, I guarantee I will deliver you a star. He went along with it, and the lead singer's name was Shaka Khan. The band was called Rufus. So I'm having these interesting experiences in the sociology of the belly of the beast, the dark land where myths are made. And one day I'm sitting in my office at ABC, and Seymour Stein passes by. And Seymour pops his head into my office and says, schmuck, if you're so smart, why don't you have your own company? So about 6 months later, I try to start my own PR firm. I started in the living room of a friend. We split his assistant. I pay half of her salary. He pays the other half. We split her time. I work on the coffee table, and I start the Howard Bloom Organization, Ltd. And the Howard Bloom Organization, Ltd., not surprisingly, is based on two fundamental propositions from science. The truth at any price, including the price of your life. And look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before. And the biggest truth in the music business is we are not selling downloads. We are not selling pieces of plastic. This is not a commercial exchange. Yes, money's involved, but that's not the primary exchange. The primary exchange is an exchange of human soul. If you are an artist, if you are a musician, if you are Prince or Michael Jackson, you sit down at 2 in the afternoon in front of a blank piece of paper or a blank computer screen, convinced you can never write a lyric again in your life, and having a hard time believing that you've ever written one before. And if it's a good day, by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, there's a lyric there, and you wonder where the hell it came from. Something even stranger happens to you when you go on stage. If you go on stage one of those nights when the audience, you see the pupils of the audiences dilate, you see their faces melting, something goes through you when you have an out-of-body or near out-of-body experience. And there is an energy coming from the audience through you. It is being amplified and transmogrified within you. It is channeling back to the audience where it once again is picking up even more energy and is being shunted through you to be transformed all over again. It is the essence of that ecstatic experience that we talked about when asking where the guards are inside of us. It's the essence of that ecstatic experience that's behind the forces of history, that changes history. It's the very essence of what Adolf Hitler knew so brilliantly how to manipulate, unfortunately for horrible, horrible ends. But he did know how to manipulate it. And so you now know that your job is this. There is a self below the floorboards of the self. And that self is the self that writes those lyrics. That self is the self that dances you on stage as if you were a marionette. That self is what we can call soul, the most essential passions within you. And you are now in the business of human soul. So working at the Howard Bloom Organization, my job was the job of a secular shaman, a strange job for a person who was using Martin Gardner's mathematical game section techniques from the Scientific American in order to work with music. Okay, the leading PR firm in the business had been called Gibson and Stromberg. Its technique was very simple. You take a record company president out for the evening, you give him whatever he wants in the way of cocaine, alcohol, girls, boys, anything that he likes. And he signs a contract with you to give you 12 of his acts on a God knows how much money per year basis. Then if you're like me and you get a phone call from one of these presidents saying, we've got this major act coming into town tomorrow and he's on Gibson and Stromberg's list, so you don't have to do anything except go say hello, and you call Gibson and Stromberg, and Gibson and Stromberg says, who? Then you know that the act has been acquired through the use of cocaine and... But, we can't say that in public, but at any rate, nonetheless... but it's not being worked. No one is actually doing the work. There's a scam going on here. I loathed that idea of doing business. Absolutely loathed it. So my company was dedicated to the proposition of soul, just as we described soul a minute ago. And none of this crap, none of it whatsoever. And over the course of the next few years, well, first I got calls from all of the major people in PR, all of the company heads in PR, saying, look, you're a nice kid. We've known you for the last couple of years as the magazine editor. We like you. But, you know, your business model is not going to work. You'll be out of business in 6 months. Every single one of the companies whose presidents called me was out of business or was all of a sudden really struggling within 3 years. All of them. Because the truth can win. The truth can win. So we worked with, who did we work with? My biggest competitor was Rogers & Cowan. The person heading the music division at Rogers & Cowan was Joe Dara. I had gotten Joe Dara his first job in PR. He had called and said, I'm a roadie and I really want to get into publicity. Can you help me? And I said, yes, I have a friend who needs somebody. I will recommend you. And I did. Well, these things don't work out well. Usually, many puppies bite the hands that feed them. And so Joe Dara's sales technique was to say, when he was talking to a prospective client, don't hire Howard Bloom. He's just a pipsqueak. Look at him. He doesn't even have magazine covers. We have magazine covers up the kazoo. Of course he did. He was with a company that had Mick Jagger and David Bowie and a whole bunch of people like that who were up to the magazine cover level before Rogers & Cowan ever got them as clients. Rogers & Cowan was a big, old firm. I was brand new. So I figured, okay, I'll make my own stars and we'll get our covers. And I did. I made star after star after star who had never been on a cover before and got them cover after cover after cover after cover. So we gave Rogers & Cowan a major run for its money, and that's an understatement. But one day in 1988, I was doing my usual kind of day. The usual kind of Bloom day was that I had a knapsack behind my desk. It had a TRS 101 computer, the very first laptop computer. It weighed a pound, and when you bought it, it came with a standard 8K of memory. If you were a nerd, you could jazz it up to 24K. Of course, I had two of them. They were both jazzed up to 24K. So I had one of those, a spare shirt, and my toiletries, a toothbrush, basically, and a razor. Because I'd get a call at 4 o'clock in the afternoon saying things like, Michael Jackson is about to cancel his tour, and you're the only one he'll listen to. You've got to be out here by 11 o'clock tonight. That was a normal call. That kind of thing happened on a regular basis. So I'd simply get a secretary to get me an airline reservation, and I'd be at the airport by 5:30, and I'd be out there wherever there was. It could be Atlanta, it could be Memphis, it could be Houston. Most often it was LA at 11 o'clock that night. Well, one day I had been given an act called the Womacs. It was Cecil Womack who wrote the Rolling Stones' first hit, and Linda Womack, whose father was Sam Cooke, the legend of pop pre-rock, and they were wonderful people. But it meant going down to Virginia. I always insisted that if I'm going to represent you, I'm going to visit you in your location so I can see what you are really like. And it's going to be without managers, without wives, without any intercessors whatsoever. It's going to be just you and me. I was heading down to Virginia to be with Cecil Womack and Linda Womack. It was going to be a long trip because it's a short hop to Virginia by plane. But once I got there, I was picked up in a Jeep and driven 5 hours into the countryside. And Cecil and Linda were building themselves what looked like an aircraft hangar in the middle of a farm. It was a big building they were building as their home. It had no electricity. It had no heat. It probably had no insulation. It was a big empty frame. And it was spring, which was March 10th. And it was still very cold. It was one of those days that deceives you into thinking it's warm. So all your visual senses are getting these cues about warmth, but in reality, it's chilling you to the bone. So we sat there for 5 hours, and I did my interview with them. And it was an amazing interview. These are people who came out of the coal country of Virginia. I didn't know there were black coal miners. I'd never heard of that kind of thing. I didn't know that a lot of them spent their weekends making gospel music. I didn't know that the best of them would go out on the road on the weekends on a bus and tour all over the place doing their gospel music. This is the background Sam Cooke came out of, and this is the background that the Womack family came out of. It was an amazing revelation, an amazing story. So when I got back after another 5-hour drive to the airport, when I got on the plane that night, I took out my TRS 101 and I organized the story, because people give you story in patches and pieces. And if you put them together on a timeline, all of a sudden it's an amazing story. So I put together the story on the laptop, and then when I got off the plane, when I got back home, I realized I'd left my laptop on the plane, which wasn't exactly normal for me. And the next day, I felt like I had a cold. The next day was Saturday. Well, Saturdays and Sundays are my hardest working days of the week, and because there are no phone calls and you can concentrate on what you're doing. And but I felt down, and when I have an illness coming on, my technique is work your guts off and do what you usually do in terms of exercise, which meant a minimum of 2.5 to 3 miles of walking. So I did my 2.5 to 3 miles of walking in the whole thing on Saturday and on Sunday, and then got into the office on Monday, and things were workable despite the cold. And then something happened Tuesday that I can't even remember, because something happened to me at my desk. My staff realized there was something terribly wrong. I was very, very sick. And my staff had to stand under my armpits. You see this in movies, but you don't really see it in real life, where people are holding somebody up like that. They had to stand under my armpits and carry me basically to the elevator, get me down the elevator, and throw me in a cab. And for the next 3 months, I lay in this room on this bed, staring up at the ceiling. Most of that time, so weak, I could not think. You know the scene in 2001: A Space Odyssey where they're unplugging Hal? And Hal, the computer, when they're unplugging the first circuit boards, is still swift and articulate and persuasive and charming when he needs to be. But as they get further and further toward the middle of the circuit boards, Hal's speech begins to slow down. And then when they reach the final circuit board, Hal sings the first song he ever learned, Mary Had a Little Lamb. Well, I felt like all the circuit boards had been pulled out of my mind. I could stare at the ceiling in utter calm and contentment because there was no energy in there to do anything. And at first I thought it was a virus. And I got better. We always get better, right? I mean, it's a real shock to be sick with something for 3 days, much less 3 months. But still, you get better. That's the way life is. And I got better. And I went back to work, and I got Cyndi Lauper as a client, who's just phenomenally talented and had a new movie coming out that was phenomenal, amazing, fantastic. It was one of the most underrated movies of the last 30 years. And one day I walked 7 miles. I was in heaven. I mean, walking to Atlantic Records and walking to CBS and all the other places where I did my business. And then I went out to the Meadowlands to watch the Scorpions. They were opening for Metallica. Well, it's whatever that thing is called over in New Jersey, the Meadowlands. It's the Meadowlands, and you've got 55,000 kids, and they're all standing. So if you want to see this show, you got to stand too. So I stood outdoors for 2 hours watching the Scorpions, then headed back into Manhattan. John Mellencamp was opening at Madison Square Garden, and I stood in the wings watching, well, I don't really stand in the wings, but I stood watching John Mellencamp. And then Cyndi Lauper was graduating from high school. She'd never graduated from high school before. And I was in Queens, so watching Cyndi Lauper graduate from high school. And that's when the real trouble began. It's crucial to understand the emotions of this illness. They're the hardest things to put into words. They're even the hardest things to remember. But if somebody doesn't put them into words, all of us who go through these things are going to have no voice. And there is a kind of confusion that the normal human language doesn't leave room for. It doesn't allow you to express. Your body is failing you in really bizarre ways. My thermoregulatory system wasn't working. So if it was 98 degrees, I could be shivering. And if it's 48 degrees, I could be overheated. How do you don't read about that anywhere. It doesn't show up as a symptom in any description of an illness I have ever heard in my life or read in my life. And I've done a lot of reading. In those early days of science, I was reading for years, 2 books a day. Still, nothing about this. And the other symptoms, there's a kind of weakness. It's not tiredness. It's not fatigue. It's not wanting to take a nap or fall asleep. It's that Well, one of my friends who had a touch of chronic fatigue syndrome went up to a store 2 blocks from her home to shop for a new coat and discovered when she'd finished that she didn't have the strength to pick up her coat. She didn't have the strength to pick up something that weighed probably 16 ounces, 14 ounces, possibly 2 pounds. She couldn't pick it up. And you become incredibly weak. And there's nothing that prepares you for that because we don't even have a proper term for it. We don't discuss that kind of thing in the English language. Plus, you have something for which there is no name. And you go through something very peculiar when you have an illness with no name. Your doctors start by doing every test they can possibly conceive of on you. And then when it turns out that their tests do not in any way grip your problem, instead of blaming it on the limitations of modern medicine and the fact that it's nowhere near where it'll be 100 years from now, they blame it on you. They say, nothing's wrong with you. Well, if nothing's wrong with you, you must be some sort of a nutcase. And that's how you're left. But there's something even worse. The doctors don't even seem to know this. There's something about naming that gives things a place, a right to be. When you have no name for something, you fall between the cracks. You are no longer a part of the human process. You are no longer a part of perceived reality. You are nothing. You are nothing. You lose a piece of your human identity, and it is extremely confusing. So these are the things that were happening when I was in Manhattan, still able to work, but knew something was wrong. I went to a fancy schmancy, very, very expensive doctor who had his degree from Vanderbilt, looked ever so prestigious on his wall. And he came up with a name for a disease that's so out of the way that you've never heard it and so long and complicated that it makes you feel good anyway. It had nothing to do with my disease. It's a trick. It's a trick like when you walk into the doctor's office and you have a terrible stomach pain and you've been wondering for the last week if you've got stomach cancer, and the doctor thumps your chest and listens to your heartbeat from the rear and a bunch of things like that. And then when he's finished palpating your abdomen, he says, okay, I know what you've got. It's called gastritis. Well, you know what your doctor has just told you? You walked in and said, I have a stomach ache. He's now told you in Latin, you have a stomach ache. Names are incredibly important things. They calm us down. They make us feel as if other people have some sort of a handle on something. There was no name for this. And the name I was given by the fancy schmancy doctor, a name I can't even remember, was again his trick. Is like Dumbo's magic feather. A confidence building device, but a con. So illness without a name, no matter what it is. Don't let your doctor tell you it's your fault. Don't let your doctor say you have nothing. No, that means your doctor has nothing. That means your doctor is missing a brain. That means your doctor is not only missing a brain, he's missing a heart. That means there's something seriously wrong, not with you, but with your doctor. Okay, let me give you a little bit of theory. Usually when you have an illness, it's very important to ignore theory, because theory can carry you off on the wrong course and totally blind you to what you really need to know in order to handle your illness. The stuff you really should be paying attention to is what are your symptoms and what can be done about those symptoms. What works and what doesn't work. If something should work in theory, you tend to convince yourself that it's the thing that will work. And no, if it works for you, it works for you. If it doesn't work for you, it doesn't work for you. Keep your eyes open to those facts. Theory even will mislead you in describing your symptoms, because theory will lead you to focus on certain symptoms and ignore other symptoms. No, focus on what's happening, focus on what works. Those are the two things to pay attention to. But now, having said that, I'm going to mislead you into the land of theory. Why? Because one of the symptoms of my CFS, not necessarily everybody's CFS, was I was incredibly, how can we put this? I'd have the equivalent of anxiety attacks. Now I know what a panic attack or an anxiety attack is. A panic attack, at least as I experienced it, goes something like this. I learned I had to avoid stressful things because they did horrible, horrible things to me. They would give me setbacks. Well, setbacks can last 3 to 4 months. You can have gotten to the point where you're able to sit up for 2 hours, and a setback will put you back to the point where you can't sit up at all. You will have gotten to the point where you can speak 2 paragraphs. A setback will put you back to the point where you can't speak at all, and it'll keep you there for months. For months. So with this illness, you have to avoid setbacks. Stress produces setbacks. So I tried to avoid everything that could produce stress. And then I was so desperate for something to read to keep me entertained when I had to avoid stress, that I went to James Thurber dog novels. Now, James Thurber, if you haven't read him, is one of those boring authors in the history of the Western world. And boring, that should be not stressful, right? And dogs, I love dogs. I adore dogs. Dogs save my life with all that unconditional love and putting their tongue up your nostrils and, all this kind of stuff that shows they're really interested in you. So I'm reading a Thurber dog story, and the first 95 pages are just fine. And then I reach page 96. And on page 96, there is a fight between 2 dogs. Now, a fight between 2 dogs, this is like 2 Nerf dogs. These are Thurber dogs. And there's only one paragraph. That one paragraph throws me so far back, it takes me 3 months to get back to where I was before I read it. That's what stress can do if your stress system is shot. Okay, now to theory. What is a stress handling system? Well, this is theory. Now, I've brought in my mentor in neurobiology, Ted Koons, who is the discoverer of what the hypothalamus does. He's the guy that got me a position as a visiting scholar at the Graduate School of Education at NYU, looking into neurobiology, among other things. And he's brought over his friend, one of his friends from Yale, and we've discussed this. And to them, this is a very plausible theory. You've got a stress handling system. You're sitting there reading the newspaper or whatever it is that you do to calm yourself down. You're doing your email. And all of a sudden, a car's muffler goes off outside. And if the noise is loud enough, it goes through you like a shot. Your whole body just tenses up for a minute. You usually forget it within seconds. So watch yourself very carefully, and you'll see this thing happening. And sometimes if the noise is loud enough, you want to go like that to the person, whoever made it. You get really angry for the way that they've totally just shocked you. Well, that little bit of shock goes away within seconds because you've got a stress handling system. The stress handling system works on the basis of what's called a Sherringtonian system. In a Sherringtonian system, you have an exciter that pushes the needle this way. You've got an inhibitor that pushes the needle that way. When that exhaust backfired, all of a sudden your exciter drives the needle over into the red zone. And then your inhibitor says, okay, that sounded harmless. It's not really creating any problem. It's an automobile exhaust, the value of names. And the inhibitor turns on and you go back up into the middle again very rapidly. But if your inhibitor is gone, then you're on the red zone all the time. And when you're on the red zone all the time, your stress system is aroused constantly. Well, you've got a bunch of stress hormones. They're called glucocorticoids. In short doses, they are energizers. In long doses, they are poisons. So you've got a system, plus your stress handling system takes a lot of energy when it's on alarm mode because it's mobilizing all of your energy to take care of a crisis. Well, it can only do that for short amounts of time. If it's doing that all the time, no wonder you don't have the strength to speak.
Who's the first person you told when you found out that you had CFS, and how did they react to it?
Well, the more important point is that you don't really find out that you have CFS that way. At least you didn't way back then. My wife knew about my symptoms. My wife has the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant disease, which means she's separated from her feelings, doesn't know how she feels, and can't express them to you. But she was helpful. God knows how she felt, whether she felt I was being a hypochondriac or a maniac or what, but she tried her best to be helpful. My doctor, he had no clue as to what I was, what I had, and he spent 6 months sending me through tests, and he sent me, his final gesture was a new guy had been brought in to head the infectious disease department at the local hospital, Methodist Hospital, and he had a terrific reputation. My doctor sent me over to him to be tested, and the infectious disease specialist, nice as he was, came to the conclusion that nothing was wrong with me. And you've seen my reaction to nothing is wrong with you. I finally figured out, by doing the kind of research I do about everything, that this was chronic fatigue syndrome. And when I came to my doctor with that news, he didn't believe me because he didn't believe chronic fatigue syndrome was real. And today, my doctor tells me he diagnoses several cases of chronic fatigue syndrome every month, and he credits me with educating him about it. But back then, no, he didn't believe in it. And this will be the problem, since you've got a health network for patients. A lot of patients will fall between the cracks of any disease description and will not know what they've got. Frankly, in 1981, I had an extremely serious back problem that started normal and then got more and more serious, and it manifested itself in the long run in exactly the same, some of the same symptoms that I have with chronic fatigue syndrome. I was too weak to get out of bed except to get to the bathroom. I was too weak to speak for 3 months. This is a back problem. Chronic fatigue syndrome is presumably something radically different than a back problem. But both of these things are weakening. And things that weaken you can cause the same problem, can cause the same set of symptoms. And your job, if you're in the boat of having the illness, is not to get a name for the illness. That's not the most important thing in the world. It's to find what doctors call the modality, the treatment that makes you feel better, not that theoretically makes people with an illness with the same name as yours better, that makes you better. You have to look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before, rather than looking at theories.
So, how did you find other people who had what you had, or how did you seek them out?
I don't remember how exactly I found them. I found, for one thing, I had an assistant working in the house. That was extremely helpful. And it was not really entirely the days before email, and yet it was. In 1983, I had computerized my office. In 1983, the record industry had been computerized. So we could actually get access to a service that allowed us to communicate via email, which in the record industry was incredible, because it meant you had an act out on the road, and normally you wouldn't be able to reach them at certain hours of the night or day. They'd be out of touch. And you didn't want them to be out of touch. You wanted to know what their gross receipts had been that night, how they'd managed to settle. I mean, I didn't know these things, but others did. How they'd managed to settle with the manager of an arena or with a promoter, and a whole lot of other little details. Well, once we were all on the internet, you had your compact, they had their compact, and the two of you could communicate at any hour of the day or night. And one of the advantages of emails is I'm awake at 2:30 in the morning or 3 o'clock in the morning, but you're not. I leave an email for you. You get up at 6 o'clock in the morning. That's when I'm fast asleep. Fine, you get to read the email at 6 o'clock. You leave your email answer for me, and I wake up at my hours when you're not available anymore, and I've got your answer. It made things so much easier for all of us. It was ridiculous. But in 1988, when I got the illness, normal people were not used to the internet. I'd been on the internet for, I can't do that arithmetic, 5 years. So I used my assistant I'd write stuff up on the computer, and she'd have to get it out by snail mail. And I found a Massachusetts Association for Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, and they had a really good newsletter. I was looking for newsletters that were good because I was looking for tips. I was looking for tips on treatment modalities, on treatment techniques. Then eventually we tried to go to Susan Levine, who had a reputation as being one of the top CFS doctors in New York. She wouldn't make house calls. She insisted I come into her office. Come into her office. I couldn't get to my own kitchen, much less get to her office. It shows you how much she knew about CFS. Screw her. I'm sorry. I get a little angry with doctors who are not doctors, who don't care about patients. At any rate, we finally found Dr. Derek Enlander, and my wife convinced Enlander to come out and see me. And Enlander did something incredibly bright, especially for the 90s. He gave me the email address of another one of his patients, a patient in Texas, and said, contact her. And I did. And then the two of us, her name was Linda Diane Scalf, then the two of us went out hunting like a pack. We went out hunting on the internet. We went out hunting for every bit of information we could find, but we also got paper journals. There was a CFIDS association, and we got their journal. And we'd go through these things voraciously, and we'd exchange information on the internet. And without her to support me, I don't know what I added to her life, but without her, I wouldn't be sitting in this chair, because she helped me find the two major things that helped me were oxytocin, which I read about in one of the journals, the CFIDS journals or newsletters, and convinced my doctor to give me eventually, once we found out what the protocol was for it. And the other thing is called gabapentin. Well, Linda found out about gabapentin. And Linda went directly to Dr. Seastrunk in Texas, who was using it, and got the protocol. And we got it to my doctor. Now, doctors are humans, and that means you give them an idea. They don't want to have ideas from their patients. They want to have their own ideas. They need to be the genius. We all do. You do, I do, we all do. And so he'll sit on it for 6 months until it arises from the depths of his mind as an idea that was his idea, and then he'll prescribe it. Well, 6 months is an intolerable amount of time when you have a really serious illness. Nonetheless, it's better than nothing. And the fact is, he put me on these two things at my request, and they very, very, very slowly, over years, seem to have made me better. I mean, I'm better, no question about it. I traveled to Moscow, Beijing. Yes, I've been in Beijing. Moscow, Beijing, Chengdu, Seoul, Korea, Amsterdam, Paris, all over the place. And I have no difficulty doing it. I have the time of my life. And I wouldn't be doing it if it weren't for support, if it weren't for my doctor putting me together with another patient, and the two of us becoming a support group, and for our accessing support groups like the woman who headed the Massachusetts CFS group was incredibly useful for many years. Even her husband was useful.
How would something like Healthio 360 and online support community have changed your life then?
Well, it would have been what I needed but didn't have. Remember, the support of another patient saved me. Linda Diane Scalf in Texas. It was only by the accident of getting a doctor out here who recommended her that I was put in touch with her. And even then, it took 2 years for my wife to find a doctor who would come out here and make a recommendation like that. If I had had access to a support community, there would have been some place I could go right away and begin to check out what my problem was and begin to share information with other patients. My suspicion is that just as Linda and I had to find treatments that were outside the bounds of what our doctor normally worked with, that many people have to find treatments that work for them, that are outside the bounds of what their doctors are accustomed to. And you can do that with a patient community. You can't do that with a doctor. I mean, and to have a health support group as a part of the normal health ritual would be extremely helpful, especially to people with chronic illnesses. When you have a chronic illness, and they're extremely common, the statistics on them are very high, when you have a chronic illness, not only is it off the charts as far as the doctor is concerned and not for real, not only is it in your head according to all of your relatives, but the fact is that you have more time than most people have because you can't work anymore, at least not the way you used to work. And the result is you have time to focus on your illness. You have time to really check around and get to know other people. And if you've got a group of 20 people and all of them are out there looking for new information constantly, you're far more likely to come across something that will help you, or even that will heal you. Look at me. I'm all better for all practical purposes within certain small limits. You are much likely to arrive in this place than if it was just you and the doctor telling you it's all in your head. Okay, ultimately what you want to do is get better. And this goes back to the second rule of science. Look at things right under your nose. You want to solve your own problems. It doesn't matter who has what theory about what, which means you need to try things. I have a friend right now who's in incredible pain. She's never been anything like it. She's never experienced anything like it in her life. She has a burning sensation in her mouth. She needs to get rid of it somehow. I have a cousin who has founded a drug company. He used to be head of research and development for Ross Wyatt Labs or something of the sort, and he's brilliant. He has a over-the-counter remedy that works for burning. She's trying to figure out whether theoretically this remedy fits what theoretically she thinks she has. Screw that. She needs to try it. If it works, it works. If it doesn't work, she can throw it away and never use it again. But the more things you try, the more likely you are to come across the thing that works for you. The other thing about looking at things right under your nose is watch your body. Try to listen to what your body is saying to you. One of the first symptoms of CFS is insomnia. Well, for years I fought the insomnia the way everybody fights the insomnia, trying to sleep 8 hours a night. Then it occurred to me, hey, my body is saying I don't want to sleep. Okay, so I broke my sleep up, this is after a lot of experimenting, into 2 sleep cycles. I sleep 4 hours during one period of the day and another 4 hours during another period of the day. Well, my body doesn't get up after 4 hours and saying I don't want to sleep anymore, because after 4 hours I get up and don't sleep anymore. And by the time I get to sleep the second time, my body is tired. My routine, what got me out of this, is very complicated. I don't know if it will work for anybody else. But I take about 27 different medications. I tested each of them to see what impact they have. That's very hard, because you can't tell when you're energetic one day whether you're energetic because 2 dogs have walked up to you and licked your face and told you you're the greatest thing in the world, or because people in your life have suddenly seemed appreciative of you, or whether it's the pill you're taking. It's very hard to tell. But there are some drugs that have made all the difference. One of them is I give myself an intramuscular injection every single day. A vitamin B12, which is a pepper-upper. It's, the injectable form is called cyanocobalamin. Of oxytocin, which is a bonding hormone, and works on the stress handling system I was talking about. Oxytocin, and a half a cc of magnesium. That's not an easy thing to take a shot every single day, but hey, it's a hell of a lot better than not being able to get out of your own bedroom. Before I started taking this, the thing that helped with my incredible stress levels was Valium. And sometimes I took, you're going to be horrified, I'll be arrested. Sometimes on a really, really bad day, I would take as many as 27 Valium, and all it would do is get me back to something that resembled normal. It wouldn't even slow me down. It wouldn't make me tired. Well, shortly after that, that was probably around 1998, 2000, there was an article, a cover story in the Journal of the American Medical Association. It was about a study that showed that patients with serious chronic diseases, you could use vast overdoses of some drugs, and again, they would just bring the patient to normal. No, kids, do not try this in your spare time at home. And work with your doctor, even though your doctor's a f***ing idiot. So a good-hearted idiot, or he wouldn't have gone into medicine. At any rate, I So I divide my schedule as I get up at 8 o'clock in the morning. I listen to books and magazines while I'm taking a bath. I do exercise. Do not exercise if you have CFS except by working up in very, very small amounts. One of the things with CFS is if you're a person who's always prided himself on breaking through boundaries, now's your time to do the opposite. Find the boundaries before they show any signs of existing.
With something as isolating as CFS, how did you adapt your social and professional life with family and friends?
Well, from my research for my first book, The Lucifer Principle, I knew that if you are pried away from your connections, your social connections, your immune system goes into a deep dive. And I needed to maintain friendships. I tested my friendships by trying to get hold of people via snail mail, because email, it was premature for email. And I realized that when we are sick, we give off repulsion cues. We give cues to others to run away from us. And we're dark and dismal and we want to talk about our symptoms, and all these things are not exactly things that draw other people to us and fascinate them with us. So I started writing. I read some Dave Barry books, and I started writing in the style of Dave Barry. And I started writing my adventures hitchhiking and riding the rails on the West Coast in a Dave Barry-esque comic style. And I sent them out to all kinds of people, and the people who responded I kept, and the people who didn't respond drifted away. So I developed a whole new coterie of friends who were willing to use the communication medium that I had been reduced to. With the internet now, because that was before the internet was widespread, with the internet now it's far more possible, and especially with support groups, with people who share your interests. But it's vital. It is vital to have the people with whom you can discuss all of your woes and your illnesses, but it's also vital to focus on positive things long enough to keep other people entertained and to keep yourself entertained as well. And the social connections are vital. Without those social connections, you die, literally.
In 2001, you confronted NYC's clerk office about getting your marriage license.
Right.
How did that happen? What brought that about?
Well, I lost my first wife. This is a normal thing with CFS. You lose your family if you have a really serious case and are stuck with it for years. My first wife braved it out through the first 6 years, then left and divorced me, which was really difficult. It almost killed me. It literally almost killed me. And I was desperate. Isolation is one of the most astonishing things you've ever seen in your life. It turns your entire mind into a torture chamber. Your mind seems to invent new tortures for which there are no words, and then inflict them on you. That's why torture is used, or solitary confinement, rather, is used all over the world as a torture device, because your own mind can be turned into a torture chamber and nearly kill you. I was so desperate that I went looking for another wife. I'd been married almost all my life. I wasn't used to anything else, so I went looking for another wife on the internet, and I found one on Match.com. And here I'd found a woman who would marry me, which seemed to be an amazing miracle. And when I went to apply, when I emailed and snail mailed to apply for a marriage license, they said, "You have to come in." And now I wasn't talking to them, my assistant was, because with my strange schedule, I'm not awake during office hours. But she was being told, "Oh, well, we have special provisions for sick people. If he's really sick, we can send a limo to pick him up and drive him here." I couldn't do that. No, I couldn't even get down my stairs, much less take a limo trip. Because when you're really sick, a limo trip's not a luxury. You lay there in the back seat and you feel every bump. And every bump takes the tiny little energy that you've got that's letting you cling to life and takes a big chunk of it away. So finally, being a former publicist, having done my Voyage of the Beagle in publicity in the music industry, I decided to shame the city into giving me a marriage license. And I made a list of something like 80 people that I felt that we should get to in order to shame the city, including people in the press. And sure enough, getting exposure in the New York Times and the New York Post and the Daily News for this situation in which the city would not give me a marriage license, and I was so desperate, my survival seemed to depend on it. It worked. They sent the clerk, the city clerk, who is a high-level member of the city council, and with a staff of 110 people, out here on a Sunday with an armed guard and a secretary to present me with a marriage license and get me to sign the necessary papers. Humiliation of people in public can work.
How much has CFS affected your writing, and how much of it came as catharsis for dealing with CFS?
Well, CFS had a big impact because I tried so hard to imitate Dave Barry and be the funniest person on the planet in order to attract friends when I was actually stuck in bed, that I wrote up all of my adventures out on the West Coast, accidentally helping to start the 60s in episodes, and sent them out one episode per week to my friends. And when I was finished, I had an entire book, How I Accidentally Started the 60s. And that book, Timothy Leary read it. Not that I'd ever met Timothy Leary, I hadn't, and said that it's a monumental masterpiece of American literature, and it's filled with scientific comedy routines, wow, woo, aha. It's nonstop waves of hilarity, and he compared it to the works of James Joyce. So apparently it helped when it came to that book. Then I was able to finish The Lucifer Principle. I was halfway finished when the illness struck. And I was going into the office very early in the morning and working until 10:30, and then going back to my work on music publicity. And that was working for me. But obviously being sick gave me sometimes more time, depended on whether I could sit up or whether I could think, whether I had the strength to do those things. It ripped me away from libraries. It made research difficult. I bought the books that I needed for the most part. And the internet was just really getting into shape. And I used it for a library for all it was worth, even though there were very few books to be found on it back in those days. My third book, The God Problem, sorry, got to keep these books straight. Global Brain, The Evolution of Mass Mind from the Big Bang to the 21st Century. That one was written while my wife was divorcing me. It was a hideous period, absolutely hideous. And I learned that if I write in rhyming couplets, it's as if I'm keeping myself company. It gave me a certain sense of comfort. So I wrote most of the book in rhyming couplets. And that may be why the Washington Post says that it's beautifully written, because these are hidden. They look like text. They look like normal prose. They're not. The book is written in poetry. And let's see, my next book, The Genius of the Beast, I wrote most of it after I began. No, that book really started when I was doing an interview in 1999 to give a video speech at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine for the 300 biggest CEOs in Silicon Alley. And that interview began to create the book. So I wrote 3 books while I had CFS. I've written a total of 6. 4 of them have been published. And every one was an adventure, but one thing that the books gave me, when I first got CFS, I had recently, when I first came up with CFS, read a research report in which it said that when people are hit with serious problems, if they've had 8 threads out to life, they do okay. If they've had only 4 threads, it's very likely that all of those threads are broken. They do not do okay. The more interests you have and the more lines you have out to life, the more likely you are to survive something totally unexpected. Well, every single one of my lifelines was cut, with the exception of one, and that was my books. And it's my books that allowed me to pull through the illness. They gave me a reason to be alive, and they gave me an identity. They gave me a reason to wake up every day, and they gave me work to do every day. And that was essential in dealing with the illness. That's more the influence of the books on the illness than the influence of the illness on the books. But that's the way it was. You have to pull yourself out of the pit.
Since most people with CFS are either dismissed or misdiagnosed, What should people do to find out if they have CFS? And then what should they do after that?
Well, my guess would be these days dive in to your website, find support groups that support things that seem to have the symptoms that you have, and keep going through them until you find a support group where the symptoms really seem to fit. Then look for a doctor in that field. Now, the difficulty is that if you're a hypochondriac, and we all are hypochondriacs to one extent or another, if you're a hypochondriac, you may dive off in the wrong direction. You may, in fact, even begin to have symptoms simply because so many people that you've gotten to know have them, and the power of suggestion is mighty. It's so mighty that med students end up coming down with many of the symptoms they're reading about. So when they're reading about tuberculosis, guess what? They have tuberculosis symptoms. We're very suggestible creatures. Nonetheless, sorting through your symptoms with a bunch of people who've had them can be a useful first start, and then finding what doctors have been useful to those people, especially if you can find one in your area, can be very helpful. Because if you go to a general practitioner, he may say 50% of the, in fact, the statistics are that doctors say 50% of the things they're presented with don't exist, aren't really problems.
So what's next for Howard Bloom?
Well, I have my YouTube series, Howard the Humongous. The new episode is up of the second coming of Howard the Humongous, Beauty and the Brain. And the beauty, Julie Barrett Mitchell, is quite a beauty indeed. That was up to 22,000 hits today. It just came out a day before yesterday or something like that. And there will be more episodes. There's a group that's organized itself around me in Malaysia. I've been fighting like hell. America is suffering a vision deficit. Nations that look up go up, nations that look down go down, and we are looking down. And I've been trying to get us to look up through space. Because, look, the next economy is going to be in these vast landscapes over our head that we are going to build ourselves in giant rotating colonies. Giant, I mean 5 million square mile rotating colonies in space. It's not hard up there. There's no gravity to fight with. And it's going to do amazing things for life. It's going to do amazing things for ecosystems. It's going to give life new environments, new niches in which to thrive and create, which is what life likes to do the most. And this has been a hard vision to get across in the United States, not in Asia. In Asia, they are optimistic as can be, and they are jumping up and down like bunny rabbits at the idea of inhabiting the rest of the universe. So there's a group called Space Exploration Asia. It's based in Malaysia, and it has formed itself around, of all things, me and these peculiar space visions. Our motto is, bring space to life by bringing life to space. Garden the universe, green the frigging place. I'm working on getting people to know about the God problem, how a godless cosmos creates, which has been praised by one Nobel Prize winner, 2 MacArthur Genius Award winners, and 50 other people in the sciences and the arts who say it's the next paradigm. And James Burke, the creator of the Connection series on the BBC, says it's the most thrilling cliffhanger of a book he can remember reading in his life. And it's a scientific book that will get you to think in whole new ways. It's not like any book you've ever read before, honest. So I'm working on that to get the message out. But when that's over, then I have to consider which of 2 books to write next. One is called The Case of the Consumerist Cosmos, and it's about the fact that this universe loves material consumption. What do you think she does in a star? That's all the consumption of material things that's being turned into light. It's heavy-duty waste and trash. So the other book is basically about the quest for the gods inside. And the God problem is about, if there is no God, how does a godless cosmos create? Because the most astonishing things you've ever seen in your life have all come to life on their own. How in the world did that happen? But the other God problem is, what are the gods inside of us? What are the gods inside of us? And that's the quest I started off on at the age of 13. That's the quest I was on the track of in the music industry. That's the quest eventually I need to solve.